Alright, hey there, welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to be discussing data types, in other words the various types of data that you can have and what they mean. Now hopefully you've been following along the lesson plan, you've had a look at databases, you've understood structures, relationships, etc. But if not, I do recommend going and trying that out first, or if you already know about databases then let's dive straight in. So what is a data type? So far we've kind of discussed the big moving pieces of a database, the table structure, the relationships between each table, and we also had a look at various different field types within there, and the field types are what we're going to focus on. If you remember in the previous lesson, I clicked on Airtable, a bunch of different fields came down like text, number, link to another record, etc. And that is what we're going to talk about here. So for every single piece of data that you have within a database or that you use somewhere in a no-code app or a no-code flow, that data is going to be of a specific type and a specific kind. Every single individual piece of data has that. And the best analogy that I've thought of for this is it's just like a file type on your computer, a PDF, doc, etc. If you've got text, you're probably going to use a .doc file, like a Word file. If you've got a spreadsheet, then it might be a .csv or a .excel, something that you save a spreadsheet into that's different from a Word document. At the same time, if you've got a document that's actually a little bit fancy and it's got images and stuff, then you might get it as a PDF. If you've got audio, MP3, so on and so forth, you get the idea. And so in the same way that you can't save a Word document into a spreadsheet or vice versa, data types are very specific. You can only use the type of data that they specify. And so a little bit like relationships and database structure that we talked about before, this is a really important thing to get correct from the start, because if you have a specific data type, your user is only going to be able to enter data of that type into that database. Similarly, if you have a specific data type, you want to make sure that the actions that you want to take in your workflows or whatever else your app might do, you want to make sure you can actually do them. It's going to be very hard to add two pieces of text together if you're trying to do some math, but if you've got a number field and you're trying to do math, you're absolutely sorted. So one thing to keep in mind as we go through this, first of all, every no-code tool has a different name for this stuff. As you can imagine, every data type has a convoluted programming name. So for example, where you and I might say the word text, a programmer's probably going to call it a string. Where we might call it a number, they're going to call it an integer. So we'll kind of delve into what some of those differences are and why you need to worry about them and why you should care about them. But before we really dive into the individual types of data, I want to talk about a concept called variables. Now, if you've done algebra before and math, then you might have seen this. Remember when you used to do the sums like, 2 plus x equals 5, so what is x? Or, 2 plus 5 equals x, so what is x, etc. A variable kind of follows the same idea. So if you already know algebra and you've worked with that before, you'll probably get this pretty intuitively. If you haven't, or like me, you weren't very good at math, then don't worry, we'll make this really, really simple. But the one thing to keep in mind about variables before we get into them is they are prevalent in almost every single no-code app ever. It is very hard to build anything other than the simplest of the simple without code. Without using variables, it's really difficult to avoid using variables. And so much in the same way that relationships were this really crucial component, and I mentioned it's going to take a while to get your head around it, variables will probably be the same. So we're going to go through what variables are, how they work. We'll then go into the data types, and then at the very end I'm going to give you an example where I'll show you on a no-code tool called Adalo exactly how variables work, and I'll also show you some of the various data types. So the best way to think about what a variable actually is a piece of data that it has an identifier. So what is it? What is the data? And then it has a value, as in, what is that data? What's it going to be? And the best example I can kind of give, because this is a really tricky concept until you lay it out this way. The best example I can give is a name. Everyone knows what a name is. But if I meet somebody, I don't know their name until they tell me. So a variable for a human being is a name. We know that variable is the name, but we don't know what the name is yet. So my name would be Niall, and therefore the identifier is name and the value is Niall. Your name might be John, it could be Rachel, and therefore the identifier would be name and the value would be Rachel. Now this is a bit of a tricky concept, so we're going to go through some more variables, but typically a variable is when you know somebody should have something, or you know something should have something, but you just don't know what it is yet. So you know that every human being has a date of birth, but when you first meet somebody, you don't know their date of birth. You know that every human being has a nationality, wherever they were born, but until you ask them what that is, you don't know it. So you've got the identifier. Okay, I know they've got a piece of data which is called their date of birth. I just don't know what their date of birth is yet. And another really similar example would be a car. Now I could look outside in the street, probably see 5 cars out there, and I can tell you right now without looking, every car out there is going to have a certain age, it's going to be a certain colour, it's going to be a certain type, is it a saloon, is it an SUV, etc. So I know all the identifiers of those variable things, but I don't know what they are. I don't know the actual value, what they actually are, until I go outside and I look at them. And so, the word variable is really key. It means something which can vary, something which can be different. A date of birth can vary between people, a name can vary between people, and that's a way to think about it. And let's kind of build on that a little bit. So, really, as we say, what every single one of those data points I mentioned, like name, car colour, etc., we kind of intuitively understand that there is a data point there. We might not today know what that data point is. I don't know what colour the car is until I get up, go to the window and look, but I kind of know it's going to be something like red or blue. The colour of the car can't be 5. It's got to be a colour because I'm talking about the colour of a car. Similarly, if I ask someone their date of birth, I know the date of birth has to contain a day, a month and a year. They're not going to tell me their date of birth was house, because that's a word for something else. Now, if that sounds suddenly really confusing, that's kind of the point. A variable is when we know roughly what the data is going to look like, but at this point in time when we are building our app, we don't know exactly what the data is going to be yet. And so, right at the bottom here is the best way to think about it. A variable is used when you want to use a piece of data in the future, but you don't know exactly what the data is going to be yet. You don't know exactly what it's going to be, you just know how it's going to look. Let's bring that to life in another example. So say we're building an app, really common functionality here, right? Say you want to build an app, and when it logs in, it just says hello and then the person's name. It could be hello Niall if I was logging into it. It could be hello David, hello Rachel, hello John, hello Eleanor, etc. Now, if you create an app today, you don't know who's going to sign up tomorrow. It could be someone called David, it could be someone called Trinivas, it could be someone called Laura, it could be literally any name. And so as a result, you can't just sit there and make some preconceived list of names. You have to accept that in the future, your app should simply say hello and then whatever the user's name is. And, this is kind of really where a variable comes into play, because you're telling that variable, I want you to show this piece of data. I don't know exactly what the data is going to be yet, but this is what you should show, which is why we've kind of used the phrase X here. So, in terms of how we show that data, typically what a variable does is it pulls data out of our database. So if you remember back to our example in the previous video, we had this idea of a t-shirt e-commerce website, and you had customers, you had orders, and you had inventory. Now under customers, we saved a few details. We saved the customer's name, the customer's email, the customer's address. And so what we would be kind of doing in this scenario, if somebody was logging into an app powered by that database, I would be telling it, say hello and then the variable, and I want that variable to pull the customer's name from that name a field or column that we had in the database. And when we kind of try this out in an app later, I think that will start to make a little bit more sense. But the idea is essentially a variable is just saying at some point pull the data from that database and show it here. And so you can really think of a variable as a placeholder. You know, it's essentially a way to design your app to show where all the data would be, but the data doesn't get filled in until your user logs in. It's really an indicator of where something should appear. And so that is by far and away the most common use case for a variable. You know, show a bit of data. We don't know what the data is, but show it typically from the database. But there's a few other things that variables can do. So variables can also be used, to store data in a temporary way. And I say store it in a temporary way to differentiate that from your database. You know, a variable can be a placeholder to show something, but a variable can also just hold a little bit of data for a temporary amount of time. Now, if you were learning programming and learning this in a different, more technical way, it would make a lot of sense that a variable is just for pulling data or is just for storing data. The problem is in the programming world that's not true. Actually, a variable is used to store data, it's used to display data, it's used to save new data, it's used for a lot of different things. And so as a result, every no-code tool has a slightly different interpretation of how this should work and what a variable is. But again, you know, in these lessons, we're just trying to help you understand the fundamentals and understand how it works. So bear with me a wee bit here. But one of the things that you can do with a variable is you can say, I want this variable, it's going to be called date of birth, and I don't know what it is yet, but the way I'm going to get that data is by somebody entering it into some sort of form. So maybe I go in an app, I've got a little box, I can select a date for my date of birth, I can hit enter or submit, and that will come through. And then a variable can capture that. And so there's two things you might want to do with variables. The most common variable is called a cookie. You've probably heard of this if you visit any website ever at the minute. It comes up and says, do you want to accept cookies? And cookies are just a way of storing little bits of data, very small pieces of data on your web browser, on your mobile phone, whatever it may be. And the difference there is it's not considered a large piece of information that needs to be saved to a database. So for example, we talk about cookies a lot as being a way for websites to track you. And what happens is when you come on a website and you accept cookies, every page you go to, every button you click, it gets tracked, and that gets sent off to a specific tool that's really good with dealing with thousands of those little bits of data. You know, you think about it, you go on Facebook for half an hour or YouTube for half an hour, how many times do you click? How many different pages do you go to? You know, probably easily numbers in the hundreds. And so if we had a database, if you look at how simple our orders customers inventory database was earlier, can you imagine for every customer having something that said, okay, where did they click? You know, what page did they go to? It would be huge, it would be a nightmare, and so people don't do that. Instead of taking that data and sending it to a database, they store it in a variable. It's just a tiny little thing, and they eventually ship it off to an analytics tool, or they do nothing with it. And so the idea of cookies, if you move away from the kind of public perception of these are for tracking, actually all a cookie does is save a bit of information to your browser. So typically if you log in somewhere and you leave the computer, you come back 2 days later and you go back on the website, it will log you straight in. And the reason for that is the computer's left a little cookie on there that says, if you come back to this website with this web browser or with this computer, we're going to let you in. It doesn't save that to the database, because then I could go to a different computer and I could log in there without actually ever telling it my password. That's not really going to fly. That's not a good thing. And so as a result, there's lots of little pieces of data that might end up being more suitable in a cookie. And the best way to think about it is, if you have a piece of data that you want to hold on to for a long time, like the customer's name, you're always going to want to know the customer's name. You don't want to forget that. And so that should go in your database. On the other hand, if you want to remember, for example, a really small customer preference, like does he want to accept cookies, you might not want to keep that permanently in your database, because every time that user comes back, they are going to maybe change their mind, or maybe they have a different idea, maybe they're using a different computer and that changes their opinion. You know, it's these little things where you maybe don't want to make a committed decision in your database. Now, the amount of times that's going to happen, depending on your use case, is probably going to be quite small, but it's just a different storage option you have. If you don't want to put something in a database, if you don't want to save it permanently for hundreds of users, store it in their cookies and keep it there. The other reason you might want to use a variable for temporary storage is, imagine you had a form you wanted the user to fill out with multiple steps. Let's say we had one page where, or one step where we wanted to get their name, date of birth, personal details, and then on the next step we wanted to collect their address, and then the next step we wanted to collect their payment details. A little bit like when you go through a checkout to buy an item. You know, imagine that flow, and usually what happens is you've got one page, then another page, then another page. Now, you've kind of got two options at that point. You could save things into your database, and that's one way to do it, and a lot of people do. But you might actually want to just keep some sort of data flowing from one page to the other before eventually gathering it all up at the end and submitting it into your database in one. There's a few reasons to do that. Maybe you've got different preferences from one step that you're carrying on to the next step, onto the next one. Or maybe you just want to, put it all, one new record into your database in a really easy way. Well, this is the way you would do it. You would save little bits of information about that. So if I wanted to capture name and address in one page and then submit it on the next page along with payment details, at the end of the first page, I could just put my user, tell the app to put my user onto the next page, and then I could take those pieces of data, name, address, etc. I could save that as a cookie, and then I could bring that onto the next page and go from there. Now, one thing you'll probably find, there are a few little versions of storage. We call them local storage. Sometimes it will be called a cookie, sometimes it will be called local storage. Your no-code tool will either give you the option, or it will say something like store temporarily. There's a bunch of different options there. There's different ways you can do it, but broadly, local storage is kind of the name that we now give to cookies. It's a little bit less playful, but it works on mobile and on a computer, so it's a nice flexible option. So it's that can be a little bit complicated. It might be something you don't want to use, but just keep it in mind when you see the phrase variable. It can mean, number one, a placeholder to pull something for your database, number two, a way to store data temporarily between pages, or number three, just a way to gather a little bit of data that you don't want to hold on to permanently, like a user preference. Do they want cookies? Do they not? That kind of thing. So, just as a bit of a wrap up then, the times that you should use variables, clearly it's in your head now that you should use it when you want to show data. Another time you want to use it will be when you want to do something temporarily. But a third time that we've not talked about is when you have a workflow. Now, we're going to explore this in later lessons, but workflows are essentially the logic, the brain of your app that says, when this thing happens, do this and do this and do that. So as a result, you might want to use variables within that process. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail at the minute because I want to make sure you understand workflows before we talk about variables within workflows, but it's a good way to pass different pieces of data around about, make little changes, again, all within a workflow before you end up making a final change, showing something to the user, putting that in the database. We'll come back to that. So the last thing kind of probably worth mentioning on variables is this idea of what we call key value pairs. Key value pairs are kind of a way of visually representing variables, because every no-code tool you use, as I say, is going to have a different way of displaying them. Some will allow variables to come straight from a database. Others are going to have a menu that you click on. Some of them are going to ask you to type them in. All sorts of different ways that no-code tools express this. But when you're starting to use things like APIs and integrations, you're starting to use stuff like Zapier, we have a really common language that we use to describe a variable, and it is called a key value pair. Now, I've given an example on the picture on the right here, which is from a tool called Postman. It's not very non-tech friendly, so I wouldn't recommend this tool, but it is used for essentially making and receiving requests for data for various different services. It's essentially a tool for testing APIs. And so if I wanted to specify various bits of data to an API, various variables, I can essentially show them like this. On the left hand side, I've got the identifier, or what we call the key, and on the right hand side I've got the value. So the key might be the name, the value in this instance might be John, another person might write David, Rachel, whatever. But this is just a way of visually expressing it. So quite often in a visual interface, you're going to see this used, you're going to see this way of entering data, or you're going to see there's this whole kind of complicated a way of writing it out that looks a little bit like code called JSON. You'll see it eventually at some point in your no-code career because it's going to pop up when you're using an API or something like that. But we'll probably put together another lesson to kind of discuss that in more detail. But essentially, when you see the phrase, key value pair, this is what we're talking about. It's just a specific way of typing out a variable and how it works. Now, I've mentioned down at the bottom, they're using a couple of data types called an object and a dictionary. Don't worry about that. We're coming to that soon. And so, every variable has a different type of data. A variable is either going to be a number, it's going to be text, it's going to be an image, in the same way every field in a database does as well. So let's finally look at what those data types actually are.